Hello, my lovely geographers. My name is Mrs. Broadribb and I teach geography down at Wilden School. So, this is for all my fantastic students there, as well as anyone studying AQA GCSE geography. This podcast is for you. So, let's get started on today's topic. We are looking at hazard management. How do you manage a hazard? Yeah, indeed. How do you manage a hazard? Which is why I am delighted to have an expert joining us. It's a past student, so I'd like to welcome Luke Dell as he's going to chat through the San Francisco case study. So we're looking at a higher income country, and we're focusing on three things with this podcast today: how you can predict, prepare and protect. So this is going to be in your paper one. This is in your natural hazards. So it's in the first part. We're looking at tectonics. We're going to be looking at those three themes because it is possible to limit damage, reduce the death toll. It is possible, and Luke's going to tell us more. So Luke, I'm going to hand over to you for a little introduction and a little bit of background to San Francisco, please. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute privilege to have you on.
It's wonderful to be here and lovely to see you again. As Mrs. Broadribb has said, I studied geography at the University of Cambridge, and I conducted some fieldwork in the summer of 2017 into earthquake risk perceptions and hazard preparedness in San Francisco and the wider San Francisco Bay Area. In particular, I was focusing my research on the Marina District, which is to the north of San Francisco. It's on the edge of the bay. And in particular, that case study is interesting, mainly because of its geology. So the whole of the Marina District is built on very soft sediments and water-saturated soils, and also on artificial fill, which means that any shaking and any shockwaves from the earthquake are amplified on that ground relative to stronger geology, such as your volcanic bedrocks. And also, it was useful to do this study in the context of a recent earthquake, in particular the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which was a magnitude 6.9, caused over 60 deaths and over $5 billion in damages. And they say that a similar event could occur sort of every 1 in 140 years in the Bay Area. And I suppose also introducing another case study which happened slightly before that, which allowed the city to prepare in the future for earthquakes, which was the 1906 earthquake. This was a bit stronger. It was a magnitude 7.8, and it caused over 3,000 deaths and fires destroyed around 80% of the city. So quite significant damages as a result of that earthquake.
That is scary to think about. 80% of the buildings, 80% were damaged. Remember, so think if we go back 100 years, thinking of my students, we perhaps didn't use the same materials we did today. So a lot of these houses would have been wooden construction as well as wooden frames, allowing the fires to spread. And even more recently, when we think about the 2011 Japanese earthquake, which then as a primary impact caused a tsunami, before the tsunami came, some of the buildings that were shaking, the electric cables, the gas pipes, etc., fractured. So fires are a really common impact of tectonic hazards like earthquakes. Thanks, Luke, for that background. That was brilliant. Would you mind starting off with then how today San Francisco and the San Franciscans?
San Franciscans.
San Franciscans, look, everyone knows, all my wilderness, I have problems with my S's. How do they actually start to try to predict then and to prepare today?
Yes, so as you've mentioned, you've got sort of the predict, prepare, protect, those sort of three strands of risk management there. And the reason why they're important is looking at the risk equation. Risk is hazard multiplied by vulnerability. So the hazard is the magnitude of your earthquake, the physical features of that tectonic hazard. So for example, with the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, that's that magnitude 6.9 earthquake. It had an epicenter very close to the Bay Area, and it's all within the very complex San Andreas fault network. And then you've got the vulnerability. The vulnerability is the human side, things that perhaps can be managed and mitigated to reduce the impact of the natural disaster. So, for example, under vulnerability, we could look at the different geologies of the area. So, the Bay Area having the Marina District, having those softer soils, which means that those living geographically in that area are more vulnerable than those living elsewhere in San Francisco. And you can also add into the vulnerability the level of management, the level of being able to predict, prepare, and protect from an earthquake. So looking at the 1989 case study, following the event, over 30 billion US dollars was invested by the city of San Francisco, into mitigating earthquake risk in the Bay Area. And that included a number of different strategies. So they invested in better models for helping to predict earthquake activity. And I'll talk a little bit more about the prediction of earthquakes in a moment. In terms of preparedness, they had preparedness programs such as the Great California Shakeout, which is run every year and provides the residents with sort of almost training and drills on what to do in the event of a large magnitude earthquake. You also have the SF72 campaign, which is an educational campaign that's run through leafleting, so regular communication with the residents, which essentially advocates this idea that following a disaster, residents have around 72 hours where they have to fend for themselves. So it's essentially advocating this idea that you're not going to have the emergency services prioritizing certain individuals at that time, and that they need to be able to survive for 72 hours. And usually that's by having their personal preparedness kit with them. And then finally, we've got the protection side. So that could be looking at some of the more physical infrastructural changes that could be implemented. And for San Francisco, that was the implementation of new seismic building codes. The building codes themselves are quite interesting. So this is things like retrofitting, what we would call brace and bolt retrofitting, which just essentially means a way of adding bracing to existing structures to help them withstand an earthquake. And there's more I can say about those particular building codes itself when I get to them. We'll go through the 3 Ps in order. But that's what this $30 billion was invested in after the 1989 earthquake, to help the residents in the city and the wider Bay Area be more prepared for a similar event in the future. After all, forecasting models suggest that there's around a 72% probability of a 6.7 magnitude earthquake, similar to the Loma Prieta earthquake, which, as I mentioned, was 6.9 on the magnitude scale. The 72% probability of a 6.7 magnitude earthquake in the Bay Area in the next 30 years. So it's an imminent threat or a risk.
And in the Bay Area, I'm trying to just remember what the population facts are. I think San Francisco, kind of central itself, is its population just under 1 million. But actually, when you add that to the whole, when you add Oakland and the whole Bay Area, and remember, people, Silicon Valley, important place probably for you guys out there with iPhones, or if you're obviously got the Android, is actually quite close by. So that 72%, that is actually a scary statistic. So Luke, let's dig a little bit deeper then into some of these Ps. You talking about the 72-hour plan. I remember the very first time I went on the American West trip. So to all the wilderness out there, usually, not obviously at a time now during lockdown and COVID, usually every even number year, the history department and me, good old geographer, we run a trip to the American West. And the very first time I went in 2008, so sadly not the time you got to come along in 2012, Luke, the very first time I went, when I went to the airport and we landed and we're waiting to get through immigration, there was a leaflet on what to do before, during and after the quake. So I remember I've used it since in my teaching, handed it out. I even remember back then, so maybe part of that 30 billion was actually educating tourists. You know, we're coming from areas like Southampton, we don't suffer serious earthquakes, we're not near a quake boundary, even educating tourists what to do. So it's fascinating.
Well, that's a really interesting point you make there about, so San Francisco is such a tourist city, and a lot of the central tourist areas are all along the fringing part of the city around the bay. All of those areas are built on artificial fill and soft sediment. So those are the riskiest areas of the city. But also San Francisco and the Bay Area, as you mentioned, the Silicon Valley, it attracts young individuals early in their career who are working in these tech finance firms, and they may not stay in San Francisco for very long. Particularly the Marina District is a really appealing location for young couples to move to for a short period of time. They get to see the beautiful views of the Golden Gate Bridge and the wider bay every single morning, and it's a very sort of equate your typical American nuclear family living situation, that part of the city in particular. And they will stay there maybe for 5 to 10 years. And if they're saying that there's a risk of these earthquakes happening 1 in every 140 years, it's perhaps less likely not only that they'll be willing to take steps to individually mitigate against the hazard, but also it's less likely that they might have experienced an earthquake themselves, especially if they've sort of moved from a different state over to California. And on top of that, perhaps they have experienced earthquakes whilst they've been living in the city, but those earthquakes might be very small, low magnitude earthquakes, and those lower magnitude earthquakes tend to be of a much higher frequency. So they've experienced lots of these very small earthquakes, which means that they have this false sense of invulnerability almost. They think that the earthquakes won't affect them, that they're sort of not something to necessarily worry about, which is quite interesting result that came from my research, is sort of experience being quite a crucial factor in determining how those individuals perceive the risk. But I'm going on a bit of a tangent there. Let's jump back to the 3 Ps, and in particular start with the prediction of earthquakes, which we know is quite a difficult thing to do. Earthquakes aren't a deterministic hazard, by which I mean earthquakes, there's not sort of something that you can look out for. They'll instantly tell you that an earthquake will happen at this exact spot in 30 years. It's very difficult to predict an earthquake. And whilst we've got these very complex, unpredictable systems, and particularly the San Andreas fault network it's not just one fault line, it's lots of smaller faults which interact in different ways. And because of that sort of complexity, it makes it very difficult to construct these models to predict the earthquakes, or at least to forecast when they might happen. And I suppose that could be similar to the weather almost. Weather is very variable, particularly in the UK, and the forecast is always changing. But at least with weather forecasting models, we have real-time data every second that we can use to improve and feed back into our models. Whereas earthquakes, they don't happen every second. And so it's much longer timescales that they're able to develop and refine their models. So they're as good as they can be, considering the technology and considering how unpredictable the network is, and earthquakes in general. But they're still very sort of probabilistic based, and in some sense quite flawed, because they haven't been able to be worked on and improved over time. And I suppose in terms of predicting, whilst I say all these things about these models not being very effective, being very flawed, but at least they have them and they're being used actively to manage the risk in San Francisco. The fact that they have this statistic, this 72% probability of a 6.7 magnitude earthquake in the next 30 years is, even if it may not happen, maybe it's going to be a higher magnitude or a lower magnitude, this 6.7 magnitude earthquake might actually just manifest in lots of smaller ones over a short space of time, which will have much less impact. So, but just having the statistic provides a framework against which residents and sort of councils can prepare and manage the risk. And it creates this sort of more tangible presence of the risk in sort of the collective minds of those living in San Francisco and the Bay Area.
So let's pick up there for a minute. How can people prepare? Because I'm sure some of my students are sat there thinking, wow, if we don't really know when it's going to happen and these models may not be right, how do you prepare for something that you don't know will actually happen?
So there's a number of different things that individuals could do. So let's look at it in an individual scale. That could be, for example, getting their own earthquake preparedness kit. So that includes sort of the necessary things that they might need to survive 72 hours without emergency services, for example. That could be a portable phone charger. It could be a torch. It could be sort of a mini gas heater so they can cook tinned foods. Those sort of things that you might need if all of your utilities, so if the water suddenly is cut off, if you don't have access to gas and electricity because the earthquake has destroyed some of the utility networks. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. I have some pictures which I can send over to Mrs. Broadribb, and I'm sure she'll be able to share them with you of some of the actual physical impacts. And you can see power lines have been knocked down, and that's going to cause quite a lot of disruption in the area. And obviously, if there's fires as well, so looking at the 1906 earthquake, there were fires that were destroying 80% of the city. All of the water that was going to San Francisco was being diverted to fight those fires, and they weren't going to domestic houses, most of which were burning or had fallen down anyway, unfortunately. So it's being able to prepare yourself for 72 hours of survival, essentially, and know what to do, and whether that's through education campaigns as well, such as SF72, such as the Great California Shakeout. Other forms of preparedness, it could be a financial preparedness, and that could be taking out a disaster insurance, taking out some disaster insurance. But there's problems with those in terms of they're very expensive, as you can imagine. And I'm not sure how much you know about how insurance works, but these particularly, if you're in a very high risk earthquake area, they've got really high premiums. So sort of weighing up the cost benefit analysis of whether it's worth buying this insurance. So a lot of don't actually, particularly those living in San Francisco for a long time, don't have any earthquake insurance. And certainly things like household insurance, normal insurance policies won't cover for what they would describe as an act of God, which would be an earthquake in this case. I was thinking of sort of other things that individuals could do, and it could be sort of small scale things within the household. So whether that's bracing items of furniture to the walls to stop them falling over, and if you're preparing yourself in that way with just small little things around the house, that could be a way to prepare and anticipate if an earthquake were to occur. So, yeah, I would say,
well, they're great, and I want to do a big plug if anybody watches Modern Family. So it's on Sky, it's on Netflix, obviously streaming services, but I believe it's season 2 or season 3. The episode is called Earthquake. They have a huge cabinet that falls down because Phil, the dad, has not secured the cabinet to the wall, and it could have killed their son. Ironically, their son gets injured in another way, completely non-earthquake related, but it shows and it exemplifies exactly what kind of Luke means. You could secure your furniture, you could try to do things to prepare so that if there is a big earthquake, actually you're not going to be hit, you're not going to be injured by a falling bookcase on you. Thanks, Luke. They are cracking examples. Anything else on preparation before we move to protection?
I don't think so. I think just summarizing that it's a combination of small scale individual actions that can be taken alongside education and awareness campaigns, and sort of having that understanding that earthquakes are unpredictable, that it's the complexity of the system, which gives that greater appreciation of the risk. Unfortunately, that can go two ways. If you're more aware of how complex and unpredictable earthquakes are, you might psychologically see it as this unknown risk and sort of have very emotional response to it and sort of shut it off and deny the risk's existence. But on the other hand, it could result in sort of much heightened risk awareness and perception in that sense. So that's sort of another thing you have to add into the mix is, as great as educational campaigns are, sort of how effective are they at changing this psychology of those living in San Francisco? There's a fantastic quote I had from one of the people that I interviewed, which is, earthquakes are a normal thing in California. You just accept the fact you have to take a risk living here. And someone else said, you have to appreciate the earthquake risk if you're to be a typical Californian. And this idea of to be a Californian, to be living in San Francisco in California, you have to just accept the fact that earthquakes can happen. And that's the idea of this, I guess, risk denial or sort of evading the risk, which is such a challenge for governments when they're trying to prepare a population for managing an earthquake.
Brilliant. That is such a good summary. What a quote. I'm going to remember that. And so students listening now, or those who are going to have me in the future, you're going to hear me say this a lot. It's better than my one, earthquakes don't kill, the building does. I've got a new quote, everybody. So thank you. Okay, let's get on then to the third bit then, protection. So you spoke a lot about retrofitting and things. So if you could expound on that. And does this include the Golden Gate Bridge, the famous bridge?
Well, I think what you said there, it's not the earthquake that kills, it's the building that does, that leads really nicely into this idea of protection. Because when I think about protection, I'm thinking about some of the bigger scale infrastructural things that can be implemented in order to mitigate some of those secondary hazards as a result of the earthquake occurring, such as buildings collapsing, for example, which would cause injuries and different forms of damage there. So, as I mentioned before, one of the things that this 30 billion US dollars was invested in following the 1989 earthquake was the introduction of new seismic building codes and a mandatory retrofitting program throughout the city. So these seismic building codes, and I had the pleasure of speaking to one of the key structural engineering representatives from one of the key structural engineering firms in San Francisco, who are responsible for developing and implementing these building codes in the city. And one of the things that they make very clear is that these building codes are designed to a life safety standard, which means essentially they're there to stop the building falling down on you when the earthquake occurs. So you have the time to get out and save and protect yourself. It doesn't mean that the building is necessarily going to be habitable after the event, but it means it shouldn't fall down and collapse on you as soon as an earthquake hits. And another thing it's worth noting is that these are set to a specific magnitude of earthquake. They're set to be a life safety standard for a moderate sized earthquake. If there was a magnitude 8 earthquake, there's a question of whether these building codes would actually be sufficient to allow these buildings to withstand a magnitude 8, magnitude 9 earthquake, that there is a risk that could impact the San Francisco area. And I will sort of shamelessly plug Brad Peyton's 2015 film San Andreas here. As awful as it is at geographical accuracy, it does sort of portray some of the possible quite extreme impacts were a very large earthquake to occur. But I always say with these disaster films, you take them with a pinch of salt because they're designed to be appealing to the masses and not necessarily to be accurate geographically, shall we say.
Nicely put, yeah.
I'll go back to these building codes and things like retrofitting. So when I say retrofitting, these are buildings that weren't constructed when the building codes were introduced, and so you have to kind of go back and retrospectively retrofit the house to be adequate to match these building codes that have now been created for the city. So that could involve adding bracings around the structure and sort of flexible bracings to allow the building to shake in the event of an earthquake and not be quite rigid, because as soon as you've got a very, very rigid building, that has a higher risk of collapse. Because it's not able to move with the ground. And so they say that these building codes are designed to resist an earthquake rather than make the building earthquake proof, which is one of the big problems I actually encountered when I was in San Francisco. A lot of the residents were saying, I haven't really done anything to prepare for an earthquake because my building, the house I live in, is earthquake proof. It's up to the codes, up to the standards. And they had this feeling that because this mandatory retrofitting program was rolled out, particularly in the Marina district, which was affected by this 1989 earthquake, and retrofitting a house is very expensive, and they thought, because I've spent so much money on retrofitting this house, it now must be earthquake proof. It can withstand any earthquake, which is obviously very wrong. It's earthquake resistant, and it's there to meet a light safety standard, but it's not earthquake proof, and by no means it will still be there and as habitable in the event of a large earthquake. So that sort of rolls into this idea of people's sort of misunderstanding of the risks and what these different measures are doing and what they're designed to do to protect these individuals from an earthquake. So that's a very long answer to the question of what an example of how governments are introducing protection from an earthquake, and that's sort of some of the physical infrastructural changes in terms of building codes, not only for the structures that are in the city, but also some of the surrounding bridges. The Bay Area has lots of bridges connecting to the different bits of the bay. And you can imagine if there's a big earthquake that wipes out a bridge, that's going to sort of stop any access for the emergency services to the city, particularly if, let's say, for example, some of the main fire stations. There's an earthquake, the corrugated steel doors get jammed, you can't get the fire engines out, so you've got to get them in from another part of the bay. Well, if the bridges collapse, you can't get the emergency services there quick enough. So it's all these examples of not only retrofitting the buildings, but also the other infrastructure around the city to allow the city to be able to not only withstand the earthquake, but to just reduce the impact of any damage that is caused and allow a more effective response to a future earthquake.
Luke, thank you for that brilliant summary. And you're actually making me think sometimes. So I know some of my students listening there right now, especially my year 11s, I do say earthquake proof building when it's not. I mean earthquake resistant. You can't actually make an earthquake proof building because actually you could have the big one. So you've really made me think today. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for coming on the podcast. And I hope you're going to be back with a future one. We're going to be talking about weather and climate and atmospheric systems and things in the future. So Luke, a huge thank you and a bye for now from me. Thanks for joining us on today's podcast.
Thank you very much, and goodbye to all those listeners.